Right, so this project is about public health. It's part of a project on market failures and public health on highways. But what I'm going to be talking about in this short presentation is public health, and in particular investments in sanitation and the mortality decline in English cities in the sort of last quarter of the 19th century. It's with two colleagues at history and a former PhD student who's now working for the government. Okay, so what's the research question that we're interested in here? Well, the diagram to the left sort of illustrates what it is that we're trying to understand. It shows the mortality from waterborne diseases in England and Wales from the 1850s to the turn of the century. And what we can see there is a secular decline in mortality from waterborne diseases. So what are the reasons for that? Basically, there are three contenders that have been considered in the literature. One is that it has to do with nutrition. On the back of increasing standards of living, people can afford to have better nutrition, better food, and more healthy food. Another possibility is that it has to do with changing behavior in terms of hygiene. So we all know about washing hands these days, and that was something that also came up in this context back in the 19th century. The third possibility, and that's the one that we are really interested in here, is that it had to do with investment in public health, in particular in clean water and in sewer systems. So what do we know about this already? There has been a fair amount of research on this, and the best evidence is coming from US cities, which, unlike in the UK, used filtration and chlorination of the water to a large extent. And the evidence there clearly suggests that after you start put chlorine in the water, or you start filtrating it in a serious way, you see a large drop in waterborne mortality, disease, and so on. From Britain, the evidence is much more mixed. So there's been a sort of 5 studies already which are sort of directly tried to address this. So 2 of those studies are looking at something similar to what we're going to be looking at, namely investment in public health by local authorities, by looking at the local government loans that are outstanding in a given year. And there we get a mixed bag of evidence. So Harris and Hinde, in a couple of recent papers, have looked at this and could not establish any clear correlation between the loans outstanding for water and sewers and the decline in waterborne diseases. In contrast to that, Jonathan Chapman has a recent paper where he shows a huge reduction. So he claims that about between 40 and maybe even 100% of the decline I showed you in the previous graph can be explained by these local government investments. Others have been looking at the type of provision, private versus provision by the municipality, and found some reduction in certain types of mortality. Others have been looking at local health regulation and found no correlation. So the conclusion on this is that the evidence is mixed. So what can we bring to the table here? Basically what we are bringing to the table, and this is where the support from the Keynes Fund came in very conveniently, is to produce some new data that we believe is going to make have an impact on this debate by basically having a more solid foundation to base the debate on. So the 2 bits of data that we have been collecting and constructing, one is on sanitation. We do not think it's a good idea to look at outstanding loans, which include all kinds of things, including municipality buildings and roads, not just sanitation. What one should do instead is to look at the expenditures, and then from that, try to estimate the stock of what you might call sanitary capital. So that's one contribution that this project is bringing to the table. The main contribution, however, is to get some mortality data that refers to the relevant population that is going to be affected by the investments that the local authorities are making in sanitation. Unfortunately, we don't find one of these guys. What we do find at the end of the day is no strong relationship between the investments in sanitation and all-cause mortality. And if we zoom in on mortalities that affect mostly young children or infants, we find nothing there either. On a more positive note, we find some evidence of complementarity between water infrastructure investment and sewers, in the sense that it looks like water infrastructure lowers mortality when there is a sewer system in place. So how do we do this? So the first task is to get from expenditures on sanitation, water and sewers to the underlying capital stock. So the way that we are doing this is to consult the so-called local taxation returns. You can see a picture of it there on the top of the slide. They're basically accounts of the local authorities, and the relevant local authorities here in England is the so-called urban districts, which were the ones that were responsible for the sanitation situation in an urban area. So in these local taxation returns, you can find information on the expenditure on water and sewers from 1875. It's been split out. You can get it combined a bit further back in time. And from 1884, we can get a split between current and capital expenditure. So the first problem we have to encounter here is that we do not have a split between capital and current expenditure before 1884, and we need to construct that. So we use a prediction model to do that, and that generates a predicted capital investment on these items from 1875 up to 1884, after which we have real data. So with that, we can then basically construct the capital stocks by running a simple capital accumulation equation along the lines of the equation I have at the bottom of the slide there, where the sanitary stock of capital in place I at time t is what it was last year, plus the investment, plus some depreciation. No, that should be a minus, some depreciation, so that's a minus there. Okay, so with that, we then basically get the first bit of new data, which is an estimate of the stock of sanitary capital in a particular place. And here's how it looks like if we look at it over time, aggregated up across the various places we're looking at. So you can see the bottom line is sewer capital, so it's sort of gradually increasing over the period. The strip line up here is water capital increasing more steeply. Black line is adding them up. And then I have put into this also the variable that has been used previously in the literature, which is loans outstanding, which is the gray area graph there. And you can see that that increased a lot over the period, but at a much faster rate than our individual measures of water and sewage capital. Now, the mortality data, the key point there is that geography really matters here. The available data on mortality across localities in England and Wales is recorded at the registration district level and sometimes at some sub-registration district levels. And the first point to make is that these are not the same as the boundaries for the urban districts that are the ones that are responsible for the investments in sanitation and water and sewers and so on. So you can see it to the left. I got a little map there. This is the Wolverhampton. Anybody wondered? So the urban district in Wolverhampton is the black bit, and the gray bit around it is the district. So if you use the district level data, you can see that you are including in Wolverhampton a lot of areas which are actually not covered at all by the urban district, and therefore would not be affected directly by any improvements in water supply and sewer systems and so on. And more problematically, a lot of that gray area around Wolverhampton would be rural areas, and it stands to reasoning that the difference in mortality patterns in rural and urban areas, even today, are different, but certainly in this period we are talking about here, are substantially different. So it is not a great idea to look at this question with data aggregated up to the district level. We need to go back down to the urban district level. There is one source which has not been exploited before, which we have digitalized to enable us to do that, which is the so-called weekly returns. They are the right units of analysis. It's urban districts. So this is the great virtue of using these data. The problems associated with it is that these were only recorded for 16 of the largest towns in England and Wales. It covers about 25% of the total urban population at the time. So we get a big chunk of the urban England at the time, but it's only 16 different units we can look at. Another limitation is that the disaggregation by cause of death is less than what we would have liked. In particular, it's difficult to study individual causes of diseases that might be related to poor water quality and sanitation more generally. Final problem is that the data starts in 1870, which means that we cannot go back further than that. But for what it is worth, this is the data that we can bring to the table here. The key virtue is that the units of analysis are the correct ones. Here's what it looks like. So if you look at the one to the left, you can see the same pattern as I showed you before. All-cause mortality is decreasing over the period. If you look at infant death rate and diarrhea death rates on the other side, on the right, you can see that the trend there is much less profound. In fact, there's no trend really in diarrhea death between 1870 and the turn of the century. Okay, so what do we actually find? Well, I'm going to show you some results here from a simple two-way fixed effects model that we have estimated. So what we have there, before I talk about the results, so we have a measure of mortality in place I at time t as a function of the constructed stock of sanitary capital in that place. We control for urban district fixed effects and for common time shocks. And then we have a bunch of time-varying individual or place-specific control variables, which is another innovation, you can say, from this project, that we have been able to actually construct employment structure and so on for the right geographical units, which is not a trivial matter either. So we have a reasonably good set of control variables that we can put into this. So what happens if you estimate this simple panel regression? If we start from the first column here, you can see if we just ask if there's a raw correlation between sanitary capital and the mortality level in a particular place in a particular year, then the answer is yes, there is. You can see from the R squared at the bottom that you can't really explain much of the decline at all, but it's statistically significant and, well, relatively small. That survives if we put in a unit fixed effect, so we control for unobserved factors in the different districts, which are constant over time in the second column. But it does not survive when we put in the time fixed effects in column 3, where you can see that the coefficient in fact turns positive, but is very far from being statistically significant. If we put in the control variables in the fourth column, the coefficient flips sign, but it's still not statistically significant. If in the fifth column, we split it up between water capital and sewage capital, then you can see that neither of the two have a statistically significant effect on the mortality in and across the units that we are looking at here. So this is our main result, and this is robust to all kinds of permutations in terms of estimation techniques and what else you can think about throwing at it. It does not look like there is that the investments in sanitary capital had a negative effect, that is a benign effect on mortality in this period. The only sort of glimpse of a positive sign that we get some effect of this is the last column here, where we put in the interaction between the two. So this is the result about the complementarity, that the two effects might be complementary. Okay, what is the interpretation of this null result? The first thing we might wonder about is it the data? After all, we only have 16 units to follow here over some reasonable amount of time, but not that many units. So what we can do as the first attempt to look at this is to basically try to replicate what others have done in the literature with our data. So if we do what Chapman did, the paper that found the big effect on sanitation expenditure on mortality decline, he was using the amount of debt that was outstanding and took the square root of that as the outcome variable. So if we do that with our specification, we still don't find anything. If we then move to what he was doing, which is to use the wrong spatial units, the registration districts rather than the urban districts, and stick to the period of time that we have data for, then we get the negative result. It's sort of not significant, but it's kind of closer. If we then add the 1860s, which we can do because we have loan state as the outcome variable rather than the sanitary capital that we are constructing, we get basically the results that Jonathan Chapman got in his results as well. So we basically can replicate what has been done in the literature before with our data. So we do not think it's the data. In fact, we think we get the different result because our data is actually a more accurate measure of what is going on. A couple of other ones before I'm going to stop. And one possibility, which I think is probably the true possibility here, which is that a lot of the low-hanging fruits were already picked up by 1870. A lot of these places did have waterworks before we get data on it, and it's possible that this is where the effect really was. Of course, there could also be econometric issues. Measurement error is probably the one I'd be most concerned about, but it's not difficult to think about omitted variable biases as well. So with that, let me stop here and thank you.